Chapter 1, The Invention of Certainty. For 30 years, 2% was not merely a number. It was a contract, an implicit promise between central banks and the societies they governed. Price stability, they said, meant inflation at 2% per year. Not 1. Not 3. 2. The target was not born from theory. In 1989, New Zealand central bank governor mentioned a rough range in a television interview, and it stuck. Canada adopted it formally in 1991. Britain in 1992. The European Central Bank in 1998. The Federal Reserve, last of the major institutions, codified it in 2012. A number plucked from television became the operating system of the global economy. The genius of the 2% target was its modesty. It asked nothing dramatic. It promised no golden era, only predictability. And for a generation shaped by the chaos of the 1970s stagflation, predictability felt like salvation. What made the target work was not the number itself, but the conditions that surrounded it. Cheap goods from China. Cheap energy from the Gulf. A global labor force doubling in size as the Soviet bloc opened. Globalization was doing the heavy lifting, and central banks took the credit. Chapter 2, The Architecture of a Broken World. Between 2020 and 2024, four structural forces arrived simultaneously, a convergence the models had not priced in. First, the pandemic severed supply chains that had been optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Just-in-time manufacturing, spread across a dozen countries, became just too late. The cost of moving goods tripled overnight. Second, the war in Ukraine restructured global energy and food markets in weeks. Europe, which had built its industrial base on Russian gas, scrambled for alternatives. Prices did not simply rise, they repriced permanently into a new geopolitical reality. Third, deglobalization accelerated. The United States, Europe, and Japan began reshoring critical supply chains, semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, rare earth processing. This was strategic logic. But strategic logic is inflationary. Domestic production costs more than offshore production. The efficiency gains of the last 30 years were being deliberately reversed. Fourth, the green transition. Decarbonizing a fossil fuel economy requires an enormous capital expenditure, in copper wiring, in battery storage, in grid infrastructure. Demand for industrial metals surged as supply remained constrained. Climate policy, for all its necessity, carried an embedded inflationary cost that no one in the standard models had fully accounted for. These four forces did not push in the same direction by accident. They were the unraveling of the same globalized, cheap energy, low-friction world that had held inflation below 2% for a generation. The engine had not broken down. It had been disassembled, by design. Chapter 3, The Slow Surrender. Central banks did not abandon the 2% target. They simply stopped treating it as a near-term obligation. The language shifted, subtly, as institutional language always does. Over the medium term became a longer and longer term. Transitory became persistent. Persistent became structurally elevated. The Federal Reserve raised rates to their highest levels since 2001. Inflation did fall, from its 2022 peak of over 9% in the United States and 11% in the United Kingdom, but it did not fall to 2%. By 2025, the major developed economies had settled into a range of 3 to 4%, as if that were the natural resting point. In the academic literature, a quiet revolution had begun. Papers examining R*, the neutral real interest rate, suggested it had risen structurally. If the neutral rate was higher, the models implied inflation could sit at a higher equilibrium without overheating. The 2% target was not wrong, exactly. It was calibrated for a world that no longer existed. Fiscal pressure reinforced the drift. government debt across the G7 had reached peacetime records. A slight elevation in nominal inflation, 3% instead of 2%, erodes the real value of that debt at a rate governments found quietly convenient. No finance minister said this. The spreadsheets, however, were indifferent to discretion. In 2026, the formal reviews began. The Bank of England announced a framework consultation. The ECB commissioned research into a flexible target range. The Federal Reserve noted that its 2012 framework statement was due for reassessment. What was being discussed behind closed doors was this: not whether to abandon 2%, but how to retire it without triggering the panic that an explicit admission would cause. Chapter 4: The Compounding Mindset. Here is what a 3 to 4% inflation environment means over time. At 2%, a unit of purchasing power loses half its value in 35 years. At 3%, 23 years. At 4%, 18. The difference is not catastrophic in any single year. It is catastrophic in aggregate, and that is precisely how it operates. Quietly. Compounding. Capital repositioning is already visible in the data. Institutional allocations have shifted toward real assets, infrastructure, commodities, real estate with genuine supply constraints, equities and pricing power businesses. The logic is straightforward. In an inflationary regime, ownership of productive assets protects capital, ownership of nominal claims destroys it. The error most investors and citizens will make is cognitive, treating the current environment as a temporary disruption before a return to normal. The data does not support that framing. What has changed is not the business cycle. What has changed is the structural foundation beneath it, the geopolitical order, the energy system, the demographic composition of the labor force. These do not mean revert in quarters. They mean revert, if at all, in decades. The compounding mindset does not mean optimism. It means precision about time horizons. It means understanding that the question, what will be worth more in real terms in 10 years than it is today, is not the same question it was in 2010. The answer set has narrowed. And within that narrower set, the margin between being right and being wrong, between assets that compound above inflation and assets that merely survive it, has never been wider. 2% is not coming back, not because central banks have failed, but because the world that made it possible has already left. The honest question is not when it returns. The honest question is, given the world as it is, where does compounding still work in your favor? That question has always separated those who preserve capital across eras from those who lose it to them. The era has changed. The question has not.